The United States has recognized the strategic importance of Egypt back to the very beginning of American involvement in the Middle East, which basically begins after World War II. It wasn't always easy for the United States to have a good relationship with Egypt, although the United States wanted to do that back through the 1950s and 60s. When Gamal Abdel Nasser was president, there were a lot of differences between the United States and Egypt on how they saw the region. But in the mid-1970s, when President Anwar Sadat undertook his initiatives to change the strategic orientation of Egypt and to make peace with Israel, the United States and Egypt began to develop a very close relationship that endures until today. The two pillars of the U.S.-Egyptian relationship since the late 1970s have been cooperation on regional affairs, that is, diplomatic, military, strategic cooperation to promote peace and stability in the Middle East. And the other pillar has been the development of Egypt itself, particularly economic development. And the United States has devoted tens of billions of dollars over the last 30 years to promoting the economic development of Egypt and also the modernization of the Egyptian military. In the last 10 years or so, there has been a new element in the U.S.-Egyptian relationship, and that has been American interest in development of the Egyptian political system and in human rights in Egypt. Increasingly, over the last decade, there have been calls from Egyptian society for political reform, for human rights improvements, and the United States has become increasingly sensitive to that and also seen that kind of progress as being linked to the kind of prosperity that Egypt would like to achieve economically. When President Obama took office in January 2009, he wanted to improve bilateral relations with a number of Arab and Muslim countries, Egypt being one of them. There had been some tension between President Mubarak and President Bush in the United States during the presidency of George W. Bush over regional policies, especially the invasion of Iraq, and also over U.S. policy toward Egyptian domestic affairs, meaning that Bush had taken an increasing interest in the need for political reform and human rights improvements inside of Egypt. Obama initially backed away from that and returned to seeing Egypt as a peace process partner and really in trying to improve state-to-state relations. In the second year of the Obama presidency, however, the domestic affairs inside Egypt have been moving in such a direction that the Obama administration has had to start paying more attention to them. There's a looming succession crisis in Egypt. There are important parliamentary and presidential elections coming, and the Obama administration has started to pay more attention to those things. Notably, in May of 2010, the Obama administration issued a pretty stiff protest when the Egyptian government chose to renew the state of emergency under which Egypt has been ruled since 1981, which significantly curbs civil liberties inside of Egypt. President Mubarak had promised to lift that, but he chose to renew it again. So that was a situation where the Obama administration started taking an interest. Also, in the most recent visit of President Mubarak just a few weeks ago in September 2010, President Obama did raise with him issues related to human rights and free elections in Egypt, and that was announced publicly. Egypt occupies a very important strategic position geographically on a land bridge between Africa and Asia. It has long coasts on the Mediterranean and Red Seas, and then there is the Suez Canal that links the two. Egypt controls all of these things. So really any outside power that has significant interests in the Middle East would want to have good relations with Egypt and would like to have military cooperation with Egypt. Also, Egypt has historically played a very important role in the politics and culture of the entire Middle East. These days, there's a lot of talk about the diminished influence of Egypt, that it's not as influential in Arab politics as it once was, and that is true. But I think that what's interesting to note, it's the Egyptian government that is less influential than it once was. Egyptian society continues to be very influential, and the trends that we see in Egyptian civil society, in Egyptian opposition movements, for example, the extensive use of social media, for example, in political opposition, is often imitated elsewhere in the Arab and Muslim world. So I think, in a sense, Egypt as a nation, the Egyptian people continue to be quite influential. The United States relies on Egypt for cooperation in a number of different spheres. In the diplomatic sphere, Egypt is very much a player in terms of the Arab-Israeli peace process. It has played a key role as a channel to Palestinians, even Palestinians with whom the United States was not speaking. For example, Hamas now, or in the past, the PLO and Yasser Arafat at certain times. And the United States and Egypt generally see pretty much eye to eye on the Palestinian issue and Gaza and what should happen there and so forth. Egypt plays something of a convening role. It has always dominated the Arab League, and the Arab League has been important recently, for example, in bolstering Palestinian President Abbas and his role in the peace process, his willingness to negotiate directly with Israel. U.S.-Egyptian military cooperation and interoperability is also quite important to the United States. Because of their relationship with Egypt, the United States has easy transit rights to the Suez Canal for military and other vessels, and has overflight and refueling rights for military operations in the area. All of that is quite important and valuable to the United States. Political reform and democratization in Egypt are going to happen or not happen primarily because of what Egyptians do. The United States is an outside actor here. Still, the United States has significant influence, and it's not credible really for the United States to pretend that it's totally neutral on these questions if the United States doesn't state clearly that it supports democratization and improved human rights in Egypt. Then the assumption by Egyptians automatically is that the United States stands against those things and stands with a government that wants to inhibit those things. And that's because of the very close relationship the United States has with the Egyptian government and the large assistance package that the United States delivers every year. What the United States can do most effectively is to support the demands that are arising from Egyptian civil society itself, not to come in with an outside list of demands, but there has clearly developed in Egypt in recent years an agenda on the part of Egyptian society and peaceful opposition movements asking for certain changes in law, in constitution, in practices. And the United States can make clear through public statements, through private engagement with the Egyptian government, and through its assistance programs that it supports these sort of demands. I think there are two important questions to ask regarding the upcoming parliamentary and presidential elections in Egypt. Regarding the parliamentary elections, the question I would ask is this: is Egypt moving toward freer, fairer, more competitive elections? The Egyptian government and President Mubarak have said over the years that Egypt is on its own path to democratization. It might be slow, but we need to move at our own pace. So the question now is to look at the 2010 parliamentary elections and, in a sense, measure them against previous parliamentary elections in 2005, 2000, and so forth, and see, is there progress? There are many calls from within Egyptian civil society and opposition for changes in law and so forth that would make the elections freer and fairer. And there are a number of steps the Egyptian government can take, even without any changes in law, that would constitute meaningful progress. For example, lifting the provisions of the emergency law that inhibit free assembly and campaigning, keeping security forces away from polling places because coercion and intimidation of voters has been a significant problem in previous elections, and allowing meaningful monitoring of the elections, both by Egyptian civil society monitors and also by international observers. Allowing international observers would be a very important step forward for Egypt in the parliamentary elections. The important question to ask about the 2010 presidential election in Egypt is whether Egypt is going to move away from the model it has had so far for the last 50 years of a kind of a pharaonic presidency, a military leader who's in office for life, whether it will move instead to a presidency that is held by a civilian, and a civilian with some limits on the time he or she can remain in office, and more limits on his or her powers. Some of the important steps to watch for in that regard: will presidential term limits be reestablished? They existed once in the Egyptian constitution, but they were removed. There are widespread calls for reinstituting them now. And will the steps for eligibility to get on the presidential ballot in Egypt be loosened somewhat? They are extremely restrictive now, and they've basically been set up to prevent any effective competition to the ruling party. This is potentially a critical moment in Egypt's political history and in U.S.-Egyptian relations. We have the 30-year presidency of Hosni Mubarak most likely drawing to a close very soon, and we have rising discontent with the government in Egyptian society, which expresses itself in all kinds of ways. And we have a rising opposition movement in Egypt. It is still weak, but it is definitely stronger than it has been. And at times it acts more cohesively than it has in the past. So the United States really has to position itself carefully now. The United States has to find a way to show that we still want to work with the Egyptian government on those issues we have always cooperated on regional peace, on stability, military cooperation, counterterrorism cooperation. But we also want to support and make clearly that we do support the demands of the Egyptian people for improved human rights practices, for greater political freedom. How can the United States do that? One of the most important things to do is simply to show interest, simply to show whether it is by statements by U.S. officials, congressional hearings, congressional resolutions, etc., that the United States is following what's going on in Egypt, and that it is interested. And also to use all the forms of influence that we have, our contacts with Egyptian government officials behind the scenes, our assistance programs, and so forth, to urge the Egyptian government to move ahead and to meet the kind of demands that are coming from that society for change. One of the concrete things the United States can do right now is to encourage the participation of credible international observers in the parliamentary and presidential elections in Egypt. Egypt has never agreed to that up till this point, but it is becoming a norm globally and also in this region, in the Middle East, that countries that hold elections that they want to show are credible invite international observers. So the United States should urge the Egyptian government to agree to that, and should urge American organizations to go ahead and apply to be observers this year.